Well, hey, everybody, welcome to Profiling Evil. As promised, we're digging into part two of An Investigator Returns to the FLDS. It's been more than 20 years since I set foot in that polygamous community, settled right on the Utah Arizona border. It's the place where Warren Jeffs put his cult together. We're going to be talking about secret caves and baby cemeteries. So why did you build this? I mean, why did you decide to convert this into a bed and breakfast when you took over the assets?
I mean, look what the government did to all the land. So now what? I just turn it over, or do we go and so this was just a piece of it, but it included all of it. But now, how many family reunions are here? How many weddings are here? How many people come here because it's a welcome home? Instead of, oh, we're here from the government and we're here to help. We'll take your land and sell it and then pay our lawyers to take it from you. Get it?
From this vantage point, we ended the video. Jessup described the layout of the compound and how it consisted of the home we were standing in. I'll circle where we were standing on this map of the compound. There, this main structure was intended for Warren Jeff's wives. But this really large building to the northwest is really what was intended to be his actual new residence. It's massive, and inside there's an additionally well-fortified compound. Take note that the entire block is surrounded by fortified walls. The inner compound walls were also impenetrable. To enter Jeff's home, one would have to enter from the outer compound through a heavy metal door. It was over here on the northwest corner. Then they'd have to drive across the parking lot to a second heavily fortified wall, and there a metal door, all 12 feet high. That provided access into the residential compound, where any visitor would then be met by Jessup or his other security forces for clearance to enter into the residence where Warren Jeffs would be located. Just north of the new compound sits a high school, built on land owned by UEP and Jeffs. Willie Jessup actually sued Jeffs and the UEP after everything came to an end, and he won the property, including this now most famous, most wanted inn. At the time, he entertained a proposal from a major company that wanted a guaranteed 30-year lease on that building to the north. He almost took it, but he reflected on another big challenge the community was experiencing. You see, before Jeffs was put away for life, only the FLDS church controlled who got an education and who didn't. The Colorado City Unified School District had more than 1,200 students in it at the time, but after his arrest, Warren Jeffs ordered his faithful followers to pull their children from public schools, decimating the school's population by more than 80%. With only 250 children in school, things turned sour. After turning on Jeffs, Jessup sued him and the FLDS church, winning millions of dollars worth of property and finances. Suddenly, Jessup had an epiphany. You see, Jessup had a 17-year-old son who needed a high school to go to. There wasn't one. According to Jessup, he approached Hilldale city officials and state school officials with an idea that included him donating the land and buildings if they would finish the school. In return, the school board would need to cover additional costs and supply teachers. The deal came together, and the Water Canyon High School became a reality. The first year it was opened, there was only one graduating senior, Jessup's son. As Willie Jessup and I wandered around the area, he proudly stated that he had done what he could as part of his pathway to redemption. You can see how humiliated he was to have aligned with Warren Jeffs, and he reminded me that he turned federal witness when he discovered what Jeffs was doing. He nearly lost his life in the process, and he remained under government protection, according to him, for 3 years. As we talked, a teenage girl walked by wearing a prairie dress, something that's consistent with clothing worn by most of the female FLDS students today. He said 90% of the high school is filled with children from FLDS families. But slowly they're adopting the new dress on that their friends are bringing into the community. He said you often see girls wearing prairie dresses while other girls are wearing gym shorts during the girls' volleyball games at the high school. He said, I suspect that the prairie dresses will all be replaced with mainstream clothing before long. Traditional polygamous dress is still commonplace in the community, and although much less so than 20 years ago, it's still happening. In general, FLDS women won't cut their hair short or wear makeup. They don't wear trousers or skirts that are above the knees. Men wear plain clothing, usually a long sleeved collared shirt with full length trousers. Men and women don't have tattoos and they don't have body piercings. Now, the women and girls usually wear pastel colored, homemade, long sleeve prairie dresses with hems between the ankle and the mid calf, along with long stockings or trousers underneath. The most prominent hairstyle that is kept is this hair where it's coiffed. Another evident change in town is the individual property ownership. 20 years ago, the land and the houses occupied by the FLDS faithful were owned by the UEP. This created a lot of problems for families who could suddenly be tossed out of their home, perhaps out of homes they even built and lived in for decades. You see, only FLDS worthy members were allowed to do that, to live there, and the church decided who that was. Only FLDS members were allowed to shop for groceries in town. And you guessed it, the stores were all owned by the church. After Jeffs went to prison, Jessup stated that he worked with the Dollar Store Company to secure a location just over the Arizona border for a new store. It was established so that anybody, whether they were a member of the FLDS or not, had a place to purchase items without having to drive 25 miles over to Hurricane. Within the last couple of years, he also helped establish a modern grocery store filled with everything that you'd find in a metropolitan area. In fact, folks, if you're traveling through the area, I would recommend you plan a stop, and grab lunch at the deli. The brisket plate is absolutely incredible. Well, as Jessup and I gained trust for each other, I pressed him on a few of the things that had been troubling me over the years. Those things that I was investigating back then. I call them my ghost stories because they were the kind of things that kept me awake at night. The first thing I asked him about were the secret caves I'd heard about. You see, we'd received all kinds of intel suggesting that there were caves and that they were stockpiled with weapons, food storage, and more alarmingly, explosives. Jessup brushed it off, and it was clear that he wasn't going to talk about it, at least for now. Since I wasn't going to get anywhere on the cave issue, I asked Jessup to tell me about how he was able to get Jeffs out of the FLDS church on May 7th, 2006. That was when federal agents swarmed the building with an arrest warrant. He and I drove over to the church for a visual as I listened to his explanation. This 53,000 foot building was filled to capacity with at least 5,000 followers that morning, and Jeffs was in attendance preaching. The building sits on a 7-acre plot of land, and it was valued then at nearly $3 million. It's believed to be eventually converted into a civic center now that the government's taken control of it. As federal agents surrounded the building that morning, they blocked every entry and exit point to the parking lot, and they were rapidly approaching the doors to go inside. Jessup received a predefined code word from his security forces that were outside watching. The security forces notified him that the church was under siege, and Jessup put a plan into motion that he had created a long time before. You see, this is really interesting because Willie Jessup told me that he'd been trained in dignitary protection by the same people who teach the federal government and law enforcement officers how to protect the presidents of their countries. See, Jessup is a graduate of Blackwater, a private company that provides security service on a contractual basis. They use their experience as former Special Forces operators, SWAT team members, and others to teach how to protect those whom they determine are at high risk of being assaulted. Willie's person of interest was, of course, the self proclaimed prophet Warren Jeffs. Now, to add to his experience in dignitary protection, Jessup also says that he attended a whole bunch of training courses conducted by, you got it, our U.S. Secret Service. Now, this is Jessup saying this, not the Secret Service. So take that with a grain of salt. Jessup had meticulously planned for the day Jeffs would be assaulted during a church service, and now he was putting his plan to the test. His response worked flawlessly. On his command, 5 separate groups of his security teams exited the building, each going in different directions. As they fled on foot and in vehicles, they created a diversion, and it worked exactly like his instructors said it would. It was the same training the federal agents had received, and yet the federal agents started pursuing each group, weakening their team. Jessup said this chink in the armor allowed him a split second to escape the church. He loaded Jeffs into an awaiting escape vehicle, and they bolted in a northerly direction through the parking lot and through a small opening that was being guarded by federal agents. For just a moment, he thought those officers might start shooting at him, but instead they ducked for cover as he drove by, giving him enough time to break through their barricade and cross Academy Avenue. Now, Jessup then did something that came natural to somebody growing up in a rural area. He started driving through a large vacant lot and down into the dry river bottoms of Short Creek. Once he got in the creek, he raced westerly until he could get on a road and escape the area. And his plan worked. He escaped with Jeffs, who went on the lam for several months, netting Jeffs a spot on the FBI's most wanted list. It would actually take months for the police dragnet to capture Jeffs, but it wasn't because of great police work. No, instead, Jeffs was identified inside of his SUV on Interstate 15, just north of Las Vegas, Nevada. It happened on August 28th, 2006, and his driver was speeding. Dumb luck captured one of America's most wanted criminals. Now, another ghost story that kept me awake at night were the stories of babies that were born in the FLDS, dying and never being documented. Some of the stories were horrific, and others were as benign as a child being stillborn and buried without the community ever notifying the state of a death, which is required. Some people theorize, with scientific data backing them, that many of those deaths could be attributed to a rare genetic disorder which spread because of the interfamily marriages that occurred in that polygamous group. A Reuters report by Jason Zepp identified this disorder as a fumarase deficiency, an enzyme irregularity that causes severe mental retardation brought on by cousin marriages. He backed it up with a statement by Dr. Theodore Tarby, a pediatric neurologist, who said that Arizona has about half of the world's population of this fumarase disease. And these patients are pointed toward the FLDS community. The doctors in Colorado City, Hilldale area declined to talk with Zepp when he was doing his report, but he says that the former FLDS members, independent doctors, and other authorities say the disorder appears to have struck at least 20 children in the past 15 years in the community. Now, global experts say there were only 10 cases worldwide a few years ago. Experts say once you get people within the same community marrying, then the chances grow of having people carrying the exact same mutation. The disorder caused children to be stricken with the disease, to have unusual facial features, frequent epileptic seizures, episodes of coma, and possibly death. Experts say these brain cells apparently fail to receive enough fuel to grow, multiply, and function properly because of the missing enzyme, and it causes severe mental retardation and muscle problems. When experts met with the members of the FLDS church about the high rate of genetic issues, the response from the people was disturbing. They said simply, if that's what God wants for you and me, then that's what you're going to get. And the interfamilial marriages continued on. I asked Willie to take me to the children's cemetery, and he complied, reminding me that one of his children was laid to rest there. I asked him about the ghost stories surrounding undocumented births in the community or burials without notifying the state. He became defensive almost immediately, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. He snapped back with an answer that there weren't any children cut up in pieces, burned, or disposed of. It wasn't a question I asked, so I queried further, and he remarked that it was part of the many things people outside of the community had alleged over the years. I didn't walk away with any satisfying answers to the question, primarily if children were born and then buried without state documents that chronicled their existence and their cause of death. In my opinion, those little ones deserved to be counted. If they existed, there should have been a record, and I'm left wondering if there are empty chairs without names on them, those who remained unaccounted for. But regardless, as I looked at each little plot and read the names, it was clear that these children were precious to their parents, and their deaths were accompanied by sincere mourning. It wasn't clear I was going to get much more information on the infant cemetery because Jessup frankly wanted to share his opinion about the state's attack on Warren Jeffs, the thing that led to Jeffs' first arrest and conviction. As we drove, we shared our differing opinions about the long-standing issue with Jeffs. Jessup mentioned that he heard that I'd been driving around the compound earlier in the day taking photographs, and I remarked that his intel was very good, considering his comments that those days were gone and that he doesn't track the comings and goings in the community. Instead of responding, he just stared at me rather intently. I'm going to use this aerial map to give you a sense of the layout back then, working from my memory. The compound had tall walls surrounding it, and Warren Jeffs' office was right in here. I believe it was the pulse of the FLDS, and it was here in this northwest corner. Jeff's office was located right here. Now, it wasn't visible from the street because of the high walls, but to provide further protection from ambush, the windows to his office were also bulletproof. The home where Warren Jeffs lived at the time of his arrest was surrounded by his 87 wives. This is the location of that signature pray and obey chimney stack that so many people have shown. It still creeps me out a little, and it was a constant reminder to everybody in his household and from the area that he was in charge and that he was watching. You know, reports from Jeff's ex-wives suggest that the wives were required to go into a special room every single hour where they would kneel in a big circle and say prayers. Jessup and I stood outside of Warren Jeff's office to discuss the day of his arrest and his ultimate conviction. Jessup's still convinced that the original charges against Warren Jeffs were fabricated and unwarranted. Now, as a reminder, these charges led to Jeffs landing on the FBI's most wanted list. Now, on the flip side, as we stood there debating his arrest, Jessup painfully admitted that he learned firsthand that Jeffs was a predatory pedophile, and he personally uncovered those truths at the Texas Yearning for Zion Ranch, where the rapes were occurring, and the rapes were occurring caused by Warren Jeffs. One piece of evidence that Jessup talked to me about, which did cause me to wonder, involved the testimony of a woman who said she escaped from the predator by climbing out of his office window in Hilldale, here in this location, jumping across a small opening between the building and the sidewalk, and then climbing a wall to leave the area. Jessup allowed me to video him as he made a powerful point surrounding the believability of this first witness who testified. Now, according to Jessup, The juvenile victim said she was being held hostage in Jeff's office, accompanied by a man that she had been told was her new polygamous husband. Jeffs ordered that they have sex. At one point, Jeffs and the man left her alone in his office for just a moment, and she says she pulled a knife out from her boot, opened the window to his office, and cut the screen so she could climb out and jump over this opening to the sidewalk. From there, she apparently told police that she ran to the outer wall, jumped over the wall, and fled to the nearby hills to the north. Listen as Jessup talks about that.
Because inside this house right here, inside that room, the girl claims that Warren ordered her to be raped by her husband, underage. And her story is she pulls out, and you can go get the police report, okay? She pulls a knife out of her boot, this is a young girl, cuts a hole through the screen, jumps across this right here onto here, and then climbed a wall that used to be another 6 feet higher than this wall. And this is the case that put Warren Jeffs on the 2 counts that he was in for, this one and the other one. So the county sheriff comes and says, Willie, this is what we got. And I said, well, at the time, that right there was a bulletproof window. It had none in there. It was a piece of bulletproof glass. When they came and investigated, okay? We had put the glass in 7 years before that. So there was no such thing as a window. It was a window, but it was bulletproof. There's no physical ability for a girl to jump from that window over the top of it where his chair sits to here, and then she ran up to the mountain, and then the church sent their God squad to chase her down, and she almost starved to death getting away from being raped by Warren Jeffs.
Jessup reminded me that the window in Jeff's office at the time was bulletproof glass. It had been installed 7 years earlier. There was absolutely no way for that window to open, and it certainly wasn't a window that had a screen that needed to be cut away. He asked me if I thought it was likely that the young woman could jump from that window to the sidewalk, nearly 20 feet through the air. Now, keep in mind, the world record long jump for women is 24 feet. That's with a running start, not from a windowsill. Willie Jessup was certainly making a good argument. Then, Jessup stated her testimony to police was that she jumped up and grabbed the top of a 12-foot high wall, pulled herself over, and ran into the northern hills to avoid capture by Jessup's God Squad, that group of pursuing security officers. Again, this wasn't likely since, let's go back to the Olympics. The women's high jump record is just over 6 feet. Well, in July of 2010, at about the same time, Jeffs ordered Willie Jessups to build him a new and more secured fortress, the Utah Supreme Court overturned his conviction, stating there were deficient jury instructions given in the original trial. As Utah prepared for a new trial, Arizona was also pursuing Jeffs. But both states chose to not pursue their cases because the state of Texas had just convicted Jeffs of 2 counts of sexual assault of a child, and they had sentenced him to prison for the rest of his life. Both states argued that they wouldn't gain anything additional by adding more convictions, but Jessup, on the other hand, believes that Arizona and Utah dropped their cases because he had proven they were built on fabricated evidence. Regardless, Jeffs became an inmate in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and he's eligible for parole in 2038. I want to mention that Warren Jeffs really appeared to lose touch with reality after entering prison. In 2012, Jeffs predicted the world would end before 2013, and he ordered his parishioners to prepare for the end. Keep in mind that this prediction came after a suicide attempt in jail when he tried to hang himself, and another serious medical problem in Arizona, and a hunger strike that put him in the hospital. Jeffs had lost everything he financially held, and in my opinion, he began to exercise the only thing he could exercise at this point, spiritual control over his members. Again, this is my opinion, but I believe Warren Jeffs was a sex addict, a pedophile, and a narcissist. I think back to shortly after he became the prophet following his father, Ruland's death. His father died, leaving about 20 wives and 60 children behind. Jeff's was quoted as telling all of the high ranking FLDS officials, "I won't say much, but I will say this: hands off my father's wives." Well, hey, everybody, this is Mike from Profiling Evil, and I hope you're enjoying Profiling Evil Podcast Season 2, Cults Among Us. So I hope you'll take a moment and purchase my book, Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. Deceived chronicles my investigation into a serial ritual cult that was sexually abusing adults and children. In all, there were more than 4,000 counts of sexual abuse and rape. Can you imagine these children having to go through this? Now, I've written it in a way that it doesn't really get into the seedy side of what happened, but it clearly calls out the abuse that happened. More importantly, I think it chronicles how the victims rose above it, how they became the victors and the predators lost. In fact, 12 were arrested and convicted of their crimes in that cult. I think you'll find it interesting as we explore cult dynamics, how cults recruit people and how they keep them involved. And most importantly, how seemingly intelligent people can be convinced to commit serious crimes, all in the name of a god. I hope you'll check out Deceived. You can get a hardbound signed copy by going to profilingevil.com, or you can get paperback and ebook versions through Amazon. Thanks so much for your support of Profiling Evil. And for those of you who are interested in supporting our efforts, you can do so by joining our channel memberships. You can get in for as little as $1.99 a month, or you can join my Academy level, my personal favorite, where you get all kinds of additional information and a little homework. It's only $4.99 a month, and it really helps us to continue to roll out quality content. Now, let's get back to my exploration of the FLDS and the ghost stories that I chased for many years. But I believe Warren Jeffs was a sex addict, a pedophile, and a narcissist. I think back to shortly after he became the prophet following his father, Ruland's death. His father died, leaving about 20 wives and 60 children behind. Jeffs was quoted as telling all of the high-ranking FLDS officials, "I won't say much, but I will say this: hands off my father's wives." He went on to tell the widows, "You women will live as if father is still alive and in the next room." Does that creep you out as much as it does me? I mean, who do these men think they are to dictate what these women or any women will do? Now, as luck seems to have it in many of these cults, Jeffs had a turn of thought within a week or so, and he married all but two of his father's wives. Don't you want to know who those two were that finally stood up to this madness and refused to marry him? One of those who refused to marry Jeffs was subsequently prohibited from ever marrying again. Again, what on earth are you talking about? Who in their right mind gives him the authority to make these kinds of decisions? Now, the other woman fled the FLDS compound. And by the way, after Jeffs was sentenced to prison and could no longer have ongoing relationships, he had another revelation. That revelation said that none of the husbands and wives in the cult could have sex again until the prison walls fell around Warren Jeffs. When punishing the adult members didn't give him enough power, he also banned the children from enjoying bicycles, ATVs, trampolines, and even toys. There were so many other sites that I had questions about, like Maxwell Park, named after William Maxwell. It's a guy who settled Short Creek in 1900. He left for California shortly after, but his buddy named the landmark after him. Maxwell Park is nestled up the canyon and serves as the backdrop to Zion National Park. Another park that intrigued me then and does to this day is Cottonwood Park. I used to go there and watch from a distance during town celebrations. Perhaps it was because it was connected to the FMJ Zoo to the north, this peculiar and beautiful spot with a large pond and some exotic birds and animals. Today, that place is just an empty lot with nothing but no trespassing signs on it. Cottonwood Park, on the other hand, continues to fill up in the evenings and on the weekends. There's a small train that goes in a circle around the park, but most of the time I visited, it was simply tucked under a small bridge. As the day was coming to a close, I pressed Willie Jessup one more time about the secret caves that I'd heard about over the years. To my surprise, and perhaps because we'd spent 7 hours developing a small amount of trust for each other, he opened up. Frankly, I was expecting him to say they never existed. If they did, I suspected they were just a small hole in the mountain and the stories were bigger than the caves. Although I suspected that most people in town knew they existed and probably have been near them, Jessup invited some of his children to come along, indicating they too had always wondered about the caves. Their enthusiasm and the mystery surrounding them being added credibility to Jessup's story that these caves were very secretive. The caves are located in one of the many mountains surrounding the community, and they are on private property. At first, Willie wouldn't allow me to take photos, but he did allow me to wander inside as he walked and explained each finger and room. It was massive, with tunnels that were approximately 10 feet high and 12 feet wide, wider in some locations. During my investigative days and at the height of fears of government attack, the caves were in fact filled with food storage and other survival items. They even had a cache of World War II era rifles and ammunition in the caves. And you got it, they stockpiled it with explosives. Now, Jessup described each room as we explored deeper into the mountain. There was a large room for female members, suitable for using as a restroom and changing clothes and living. It was a personal space just for the women. There was an equally sized room for the men, compromised of the same kinds of capabilities. At the very back of the cave was a hole drilled hundreds of feet upward, providing airflow into the cave. It was February when we went inside, but you can comfortably exist without a heavy jacket in there. It was amazing. But I was most intrigued by one of the rooms in the cave that had a large metal door, almost like a safe door on it. The room was huge and once held all of the explosives that the FLDS had. The ghost stories were true, but I learned that these caves were only a surprise to the community and local law enforcement. According to Jessup, the United States Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the Department of Justice knew all about the caves, and they actually authorized their use for the storage of explosives. Now, Jessup says because there were dangerous items stored in there, it was never made public. I don't know how true that is, but what is true is that Willie Jessup told me face to face that the explosives and the weapons were there, as well as food storage. As we prepared to leave the caves, he took my camera and he recorded me talking about the caves. He wouldn't allow me to photograph him at this stage, and I'm not sure quite why, but I appreciated him allowing me to capture and prove this ghost story was true. Here I am inside of the caverns that people have asked questions about for so many years down in this region. And we're not going to share where it is. I've been graciously allowed to come in here and learn the story behind it, to go back into the back arms of this thing and look around and see what it was used for. The uses aren't nefarious. In fact, I don't even know that I'm privileged to say what it was used for, but it was a sanctioned thing that was watched closely at the federal government level. They were aware of it. There was never any secrecy involved. It was something that had to be held in the way that it was, and I just feel honored that Willie allowed me to come in and look around and see this, and to frankly shatter that ghost story that we heard. As Willie and I said our goodbyes, I walked away with a much different opinion of the man. We weren't buddies by any stretch of the imagination, and will probably always remain in adversarial roles for the rest of our lives. But now I know I can call him and have a frank discussion about things. I believe he knows that he can do the same with me. He's gone through his own personal journey through hell. His testimony against Warren Jeffs probably placed the final nail in Warren's coffin, so to speak. But it also could have cost Willie his life, and he became a hunted man who lived under federal protection for a number of years while the FLDS church suffered major hemorrhages in membership and financial support. Jessup profited in the long run when he sued Warren Jeffs and the FLDS for millions of dollars, and he's worked toward his own form of redemption, using that money and property to somehow give back a little to the community. The compound that would have become Warren Jeffs' newest fortress is now a hotel bearing the name Zion's Most Wanted. And it is a busy place where curiosity seekers come to learn more. As I drove away from the communities of Colorado City and Hilldale, I kind of laughed as I instinctively glanced into my rearview mirror closely. I still expected Willie's God Squad to be performing their special surveillance techniques this many years later. Well, hey folks, as I leave Colorado City and Hilldale, I can't think of a better time than to share some of my thoughts while I'm driving here, give you, hopefully out of the side window, a little bit of a view of the area as the sun's getting ready to go down. This has been a really intriguing day. First and foremost, to, after 20-something years, be able to meet face-to-face with my former nemesis, the bodyguard to actually 3 of the prophets of the FLDS church. Going back to Johnson, this individual, Willie Jessup, was put in a position of authority over all of the security for the prophet Johnson. When he died, Willie was brought back to serve as the personal bodyguard to the new prophet, Rulon Jeffs, which Rulon reigned for many, many years. And then after his death in 2002, and then after his death in 2002, to go in as the personal bodyguard to Warren Jeffs, and served in that capacity until he turned him in to federal law enforcement officers in the case that actually put him in prison for life for the rape of this young girl in the top of their little church building in Texas, witnessed by 2 other juvenile girls who were forced to watch him rape this child. An absolutely horrid event, and a horrid human being taking advantage of that small child. Really interesting to meet with Willie and talk through some of the things that troubled me 20 years ago as an investigator, and today was able to find some answers to. One, that he went through a personal journey through hell himself, having committed himself and all of his resources to protecting Warren Jeffs because he believed he was a prophet of God. We talked about the 7 criminal charges filed by the state of Utah and the 7 filed by the state of Arizona. And Willie actually had all of the evidence, and we were able to sit down and go through the evidence today. And he showed me where there were problems with the state's evidence. And it was rather compelling, especially regarding the very critical testimony of the victim who says that she was raped by Warren Jeffs. In the end, if you paid any attention to that, that case was sent back by the Supreme Court, if I have it all right, and the state chose to not pursue charges again, knowing that Jeffs was facing these bigger charges in Texas and would likely spend the rest of his life in prison there. I found it really interesting when Willie spoke about the personal hell that he went through. Again, think about this. There's this doctrine called the Doctrine of Clean Hands, and Willie had his hands dirty because of his job. He would have done anything to protect those 3 prophets that he was called to protect. In fact, he said that if they would have asked him to kill, he very well may have done that, knowing that they were prophets of his God. And I found that really interesting. But the hell that he went through is he actually even believed in Warren Jeffs more when he discovered there were pieces of evidence that the state could not stand behind and prove. And he believed that that was proof that Warren Jeffs was a prophet, that he was framed, that he wasn't doing all these evil things, until he learned of the child in Texas. And he decided to investigate that himself and came to know that that was actually very true, that this child had suffered traumatically. And it was at that point he actually called the federal government and said, here's the proof that you need to put Warren Jeffs in prison for the rest of his life. It caused a huge chasm across the FLDS, and people started leaving in droves, to the point that the federal government actually had to put him in and under federal protection for a while to help prevent him from being executed by former cult members. And so that was really interesting to hear him walk through that, and to see the emotion even today, now many years later, as he talked about coming to that realization that Warren Jeffs was a predatory pedophile and a child rapist. And he has very strongly announced that those are his opinions and feelings about Warren Jeffs, and that Warren Jeffs will be one of those people in his book that he says, quote, will go down in history like Adolf Hitler. That's a really powerful, damning comment right there, isn't it? So that was really pretty interesting as well. Now, we talked about some of the ghost stories that I had heard over time. And one of those ghost stories had to do with how, when the FBI and the federal agents and state agents attempted to arrest Warren Jeffs in 2006 at the big church they held, how he got away. And it was really interesting, because what I learned, and I didn't know this before, but Willie Jessup had gone through training at Blackwater in protection of dignitaries. He had gone through training sponsored by the Secret Service, and he had practiced over and again with his security team how they would get Warren Jeffs out of that church building if there was ever an assassination attempt on him there, or an attempt to take him into custody by law enforcement. And on that particular Sunday, when the raid happened on that church, there were probably 5,000 people inside of the church. And as you look at the video that I have, you can see it was a massive building that they put together and built in this thing. In that particular instance, federal and state law enforcement officers closed off all of the exits to the building, and it was at that point that Willie's team went into action, and their plan was great, and it worked incredibly well. In fact, it worked flawlessly for them. What happened is, as the federal agents approached the building, then Willie had 5 pre-designed teams that ran from the church, jumped in vehicles, and took off. His response of sending those 5 teams out caused a division among all of the agents that were on the scene, and they each started pursuing different groups of those 5, whittling down the people that were left to take care of all of 5,000 people to a very small number of agents. He said that he jumped into their vehicle. When Willie Jessup led Warren Jeffs from that church meeting house, into the red Escalade, which incidentally was the same vehicle that he was arrested in when he was down in Las Vegas, when he was finally arrested as the top person on the FBI's most wanted list. He said the numbers of officers on scene were so small that he was able to drive past them through a barricade and onto the street and then go away. He thought that they might fire on him, but they did not. And he was able to escape with the Prophet. Of course, then Warren Jeffs went on the lam for another, I think, 3 or 4 months until he was arrested in a regular traffic stop and taken into custody. So that was an interesting ghost story that I was able to tie up after this many years. The other happened to revolve around the children's cemetery. And I mentioned coming in early this morning that one of my concerns were all of the ghost stories that suggested that because of all of the close familial ties and relationships in this generational polygamous cult, that there were reports and a lot of news media reports that the children were having birth defects and other defects. When you look at many of the children in Colorado City, not only did back in those days many of them dress the same, but many of them looked the same, and there were family resemblances across the board with them. Well, that was part of the ghost stories, that was the incestuous relationships that were reported were creating all kinds of birth defects and leading to problems, which ended up leading to stillbirths. I spent probably 40 minutes in the children's cemetery today, and I actually found myself feeling a great deal of compassion for all those mothers and fathers, whether they practiced the belief system that I agreed with or not. I couldn't imagine the heartache of losing those children. And when you look at these little graves, it was really disturbing to think of the number of children that died. The ghost stories were simply that children were undocumented at birth, that some children were buried without any records or disposed of in other ways, including horrendous ghost stories about them being fed to the pigs where they could be consumed, and all the evidence would disappear. And so I talked to Willie about that, and tears filled his eyes, and he said, imagine how horrible that sounds to those of us who have lived here, who loved our children and love our children, that people would think that we would do that to our own offspring. And I felt the sincerity in his voice, and I could see the emotion in his face. So there was no question in my mind that Willie Jessup never participated in that, nor knows of anyone that did. I don't know if it answers the question to the ghost stories that I heard throughout my career and whether there's some truth to it. There still may be. As I have often said many times in my career, I found that where there's smoke, there's fire. And where these kinds of things happen, it may end up being that it was only an isolated incident that created the ghost story that then becomes rampant activity. And I just don't know that any of that was possible at that time. I think there would have been more evidence come forward over the years if, in fact, that was happening at the scale that some conspiracy theorists would like us to believe. So I was glad to resolve that ghost story as well. Well, I hope you'll all take a moment to weigh in on this video and Season 2 podcast, Cults Among Us. If you like this episode, hit that like and subscribe button and share it with your personal networks. You can subscribe to Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And please check us out on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Hey folks, I also want to just take a minute and personally thank you for supporting us financially through our channel memberships. You can do so for as little as $1.99 a month, and it really does help us out. If you'd like to learn more about criminal profiling and the investigative analysis process, I hope you'd consider joining our new Profiling Evil Academy. It's only $4.99 a month, and you get special content ahead of everyone else, including one-on-one discussions that won't be available. The link can be found down below. And again, thanks for supporting Profiling Evil, and we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene.